Good evening and welcome to St. John. I'm Pastor Mark Urson, and it is good to see you here tonight. I am glad for this gathering tonight. In this place we speak of a hope, an enduring hope, a death-defying hope. And so it is good for us to gather in this place of hope, to seek out hope in the face of such tragedy. It's good to come together to encourage one another. Because let's face it, the world sucks, right? And in these difficult times, it is good to encourage one another. And it seems to be at its worst when not only we see innocents dying, but we see lives lost of people who are working to make this world a better place, who have dedicated their lives to peace and justice and wholeness and health. And so it is these days when I shake my fist to heaven and I need the encouragement of others to continue on, to make it seem like it is worthwhile to keep dedicating our lives to making this world a better place. So tonight we mourn many lives, but we also celebrate the work of 6 significant lives of people who work so hard to make this world better. So I hope tonight you hear words of encouragement, words of hope, words that are spoken here, words that are sung here. May we all come out renewed with a sense that we must keep going on in the name of hope. Welcome.
Hi, when we were organizing this thing, I said I didn't want to be anywhere near the front of the pulpit. But Eric Sawyer, unfortunately, who was going to moderate this evening, is having, he had hip surgery, and his doctor hasn't cleared him to travel yet. So unfortunately, it's going to have to be me. But we thought that we'd have this time right now, we would set aside for anyone who wanted to give a personal eulogy. I have some eulogies to read as well that were sent by the various Dutch organizations that our friends represented. If I can ask, how many people want to make a personal eulogy? Or have a personal eulogy to? Okay. All right. Well, I'll just start just a little bit because I think I'm maybe a little unusual in that I did sort of have an intersection with each of these people, and but mostly Joop. I'll read actually what I prepared or what I pulled from other sources about Joop. Dr. Joop Lang helped organize and extend efforts to offer treatment and retroviral treatment to people in resource-limited settings. He was a professor of medicine, head of the Department of Global Health at the Academic Medical Center at the University of Amsterdam. He was executive scientific director for the Amsterdam Institute of Global Health and Development, chair of their steering committee. He'd been involved in HIV and AIDS research since 1983. He had been architect and principal investigator of several pivotal trials on antiretroviral therapy and on the prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV in both the developed and the developing world. I met Joop when I tried to escape New York for a while. I went to Amsterdam in 1990 and lived there for about a year. And I initially stayed with one of the Dutch doctor friend, Eric Hochheimer. And I met Joop at some function, and I was introduced as the boy from ACT UP. And what was funny then is I wasn't really a treatment activist yet. I was just a person who yelled at buildings at the time. And when I came back from New York, or from Amsterdam to New York, and half my friends were dead, that's when I started shifting gears and going more into treatment activism. And I then met Joop again a couple of years later, and he remembered me, and I was partly because I addressed him in Dutch, and so I was always, Joop and I were always friendly, and I was, and I worked with him on some of the, as sort of an activist works with medical directors on some of the early prevention of mother-to-child transmission studies, and then when I went to Cape Town in 2000 and moved to Cape Town, I was very pleased that Joop had actually started working on the same issues that I was working on internationally. He held various positions at AMC, but he was also chief of clinical research and drug development of the Global Program on AIDS for the World Health Organization in Geneva from 1992 to 1995. From 2002, he was president of the International AIDS Society. He served on numerous advisory boards for both private and public sector organizations, including Strategic and Technical Advisory Committee of WHO's HIV Department and the External Advisory Committee of the U.S. HIV Vaccines Trial Network, and the International Advisory Board of the Institute for Global Health of Imperial College. He also served as chairman of the Farm Access Foundation, which he founded, and scientific advisor to the board of Health Insurance Fund Foundation, which pioneers mechanisms to help people in resource-limited settings access health care. He was member of the supervisory board of the KNCV Tuberculosis Foundation. You founded and was editor-in-chief of the Journal of Antiretroviral Therapy and served on several other editorial boards of scientific journals. He published more than 350 papers in peer-reviewed journals and guided more than 30 PhD students. At the AIDS conference this year in Melbourne, one of the things that he was going to be working on was promoting the new 90-90-90 initiative, which tries to set targets for getting 90% of the people living with HIV providing access to testing, 90% of people who test positive access to treatment, early treatment, and 90% retention and care, so that they're actually on successful treatment and they don't fall through the cracks, which is a big issue for programs in resource-limited settings. So, and there are a lot of challenges to making that sort of thing happen, and we needed you to help us. At this point, I think I'll leave it for someone else, anyone else who wants to, and I'll come up again later.
Whom the gods love die young. I've heard this too often as family funerals and for those who were cut down in AIDS. In the fight against AIDS, we are all too painfully aware of the specter of death. It is constantly with us. It was not AIDS that took our colleagues, but rather a senseless, cowardly, brutish moment that destroyed MH17 flight. Those victims were robbed of their life and were robbed of their potential for ending AIDS now. MH17 flight carried Jupe and Jacqueline, Pim, Glenn, Martine, Lucy, and Maria, and I knew 4 of the people. We don't ever know or will ever know who else on MH17 passenger lists were researchers, advocates, or persons with AIDS who were traveling to Melbourne. So let us honor all 298 passengers lost in the Russian terrorist act last month. Lord Byron, the Englishman, was a leading figure in the Romantic moment at a time was a poet, and in his poem Don Juan, he created some of his best poetry to elaborate on the ancient Greek ideal of perfection, not unlike these individuals in the AIDS science, who were artists and rebels with their own ideas on how to end AIDS. Happy they, thrice fortunate, who of that fragile mole, the precious porcelain of human clay, break with the first fall. They can ne'er behold the long year linked with the heavy day on day, and all which must be born and never told, while life's strange principle will often lie deepest in those who long the most to die. Whom the gods love die young, was said of yore, and many deaths do they escape by this, the death of friends and that which slays even more, the death of friendship, love, youth, and all that is, except mere breath, and since the silent shore awaits, at last even those whom longest miss, the old archer's shaft, perhaps the early grave, which men weep over, may be meant to save. Canto 4 and stanzas 11 and 12, Don Juan. Jupe and I met in 1992, Jonathan Mann, who was friends with Mary Lou Clemens, who I was working at Johns Hopkins University, introduced me to Jupe and to my European boyfriend, Erling. And Jupe and I didn't continue on an AIDS front. We sent Christmas cards to each other. And he basically told me about his family, and I told him about what was happening with me. And we continued that for about 17 years with postcards after that. So I will miss Jupe, but I'll miss Glenn, and I'll miss Jacqueline, and I'll miss a few other people. And I hope that we can take from this, and we can all continue their work. And I'm in ACT UP, and There's not a lot of people in ACT UP, but there's other organizations that are needing people to get involved, and I hope you all will take this as a way to get involved again.
I worked with Glenn at the World Health Organization in Geneva for many years, but I actually grew up in Holland and worked with everyone on this list for many years when I was working there. I found out about the flight on my birthday. I was actually celebrating a big birthday, and it struck me that Glenn, for a few weeks before that, had been so excited about a big birthday that would have been coming up for him, and he wasn't going to be able to celebrate that. I wrote to Mario Reviglione, who's the director of the Global TB Department at WHO, and I said, tell me what you want me to say about Glenn, because they were joined at the hip. They were always together and traveling and trying to communicate about tuberculosis, which nobody really wants to hear about because it's a silent disease. And Mario sent this to me, which he asked me to read out. I recruited Glenn after he left the BBC, as he thought a journalist with that experience was exactly what was needed in the TB world. Indeed, Glenn revolutionized our way of handling media at WHO. He had and further developed a network of journalists that we could contact and influence in our communications on TB at any time. I always remember Glenn was always on the phone. He was on a phone, a BlackBerry, and then an iPhone, and I always wondered how he was able to manage all these devices and then the iPad and everything. But he did it with such aplomb. It was always so graceful and so elegant. He developed attractive news out of, at times, scarce data, or quite frankly, shitty data. And he used to come up with slogans and expressions and taglines that we could use to promote the ideas in press releases and documents. And he came up with beautiful brochures in which we could talk about this disease and try and convince people to put funding into it. He introduced fact sheets. Very hard to know now, but this is, WHO a few years back. It was hard to introduce anything, but he did it successfully. He made them change the way they were communicating, because not everyone could read a 200-page document where you had to find buried in the text on page 98 and page 300 a recommendation. Glenn came up with an easy way to talk about TB, where in one page you got all the information, all the recommendations right up front. He was the one who said, we need to take people in the TB department and get them to learn how to speak to media and be able to communicate, not in a scientific manner, but in a manner that everyone will understand. And he actually taught everybody, in 120 people, he trained all of us to be able to speak to the media effectively. But the best of Glenn was really during action. He was the one who, regardless of where we were, and with WHO, we had to travel a lot and go to a lot of events and meetings, but this was where Glenn excelled, because he was able to bring together all the different stakeholders with very different agendas to come and to be able to talk about that one simple single message. How do we stop tuberculosis? How do we stop TB, HIV co-infection from killing people we have worked so hard to put onto antiretroviral therapy? This was where Glenn really excelled. He joined us in all major events, and it was a true pleasure to see him in action during travels in different countries. As I said, he would run around with his phone and call media, organize interviews. He was always rushing Mario to TV studios and trying to get him to sound good and look good. And Glenn was the one who was able to really succeed in doing that. And Mario said the one thing he remembered was, running through traffic all the time in various cities in London and New York and Washington, but always being able to have a joke and a laugh with Glenn, because that was what Glenn really excelled at, making everyone very, very comfortable. And so we were always making jokes, and were able to transform really stressful situations into laughs and enjoyment. That was Glenn Thomas, a colleague, a friend, and a professional top-level communicator. And though he won't be able to celebrate his big birthday, we all here celebrate everything that would have gotten him up to that point. I just want to also say hartelijk bedankt voor uw geweldig werk. For Joep and Martine, Pim, Lucie, and Jacqueline, you will be missed.
I'm being Eric Sawyer tonight, so you'll have to imagine me a couple feet taller. Eric Sawyer is a co-founding member of ACT UP New York, a co-founder of Housing Works and Health Gap, and he currently works for UNAIDS in the New York City office. And he wrote, "Dear friends, I'm sad that I'm not well enough to be there today. I am still homebound recuperating after hip replacement surgery. It is with a heavy heart that I write this because I am full of grief over the senseless loss of several of our comrades in the global battle against HIV. I'm also full of rage that their lives were claimed by a military conflict that, like the global HIV crisis, seems to also be caused by the soulless elite who lack concern for human life and social justice, caused by people who only care about power and wealth and care not about human life, dignity, or rights. The events that claim the lives of those we honor today hurt even more because it opens in many of us grief for other fallen heroes killed in a plane crash. In my case, Jonathan Mann and his wife, AIDS vaccine researcher Mary Lou Clemens Mann, who perished in the 1998 Swiss Air Flight 111 crash on their way to an AIDS meeting in Geneva. I met both Jonathan Mann and Joop in 1992 during the run-up to and the aftermath of the Amsterdam Harvard AIDS Conference. They were both true gentlemen, incredibly smart and dedicated to human rights and human dignity. Both were truly wonderful, caring people. Like Jonathan, Joop's life partner, Jacqueline, also involved in the HIV response, was traveling with him to the Melbourne conference and lost her life with her husband in the plane crash. Both Jonathan and Joop were visionary humanitarians. Jonathan Mann helped center the HIV response in human rights and compassion and turned the tide away from discussions of mandatory testing and quarantine. Joop was an early supporter of combination therapy, treatment access in the developing world, and in human rights protections for key populations. Joop was part of an AIDS 2031 project I worked on for UNAIDS and was always promoting a rights-based approach. All of the HIV community members lost on this flight were doing important work. I crossed paths with Glenn Thomas, also working in the UN system for WHO, and admired his energy, spirit, and gift with words. While I did not know the other victims of this crash, they were all doing God's work. Dutch AIDS Funds has long supported the work of people living with HIV, and while I was a member of GNP Plus in the mid-1990s, they were our primary sponsor. Stop AIDS Now is also a critical partner in the civil society HIV response, helping to fight HIV, and I know their important work will continue even without the courageous friends we're honoring today. We owe it to their honor to continue to support the work they were doing and to honor their lives by continuing their work. I hope you will continue working with me in the global HIV response to honor their memories.
Yeah, I also said that I would, I told some of the Dutch organizations I'd read some of their eulogies. I think I'm just going to wing it a little bit more. Because, like I said, I did intersect with each of these people, although sometimes tangentially. Lucy Van Mens, I probably knew the least, but I mean, I knew exactly who she was. She was a fixture at conferences, at AIDS conferences especially. She began working in Amsterdam in STI prevention, sexually transmitted diseases, infection prevention, and worked and then started working with sex workers in Amsterdam. She became a crusader for the female condom, and was a director of the program development and support for the female health company. And one of the things that she did was to work with local AIDS service organizations in resource-limited countries in Africa to try to actually make female condoms available, which they're not very readily available, and particularly for sex workers who had a demand for the female condom. She also worked on sex workers' rights in those countries and on women's sexual health and reproductive rights in general. She was always, like I said, she was always at these meetings, and she was funny. She would always stand up and give an intervention in a session if she thought that positive women's sexual reproductive rights weren't being respected, or if sex workers' needs were being neglected in a pertinent presentation. So, and she had a droll way about her. Pim worked for Stop AIDS Now and a little bit for AIDS funds as well. He was he started out as a human rights activist and a democracy activist, working as an apprentice in the Dutch legislature, and he branched out. Once he started working in AIDS, I think it was around 2012. Well, he had done work before that, but he worked. He did some amazing work for getting Stop AIDS, some of the Stop AIDS Now key projects funded. He secured more funding for the Global Fund at a time when nobody was funding it from the Dutch government. And he also affected legislation targeting sex workers in Holland. Internationally, his work helped fund one project that I was involved in, which was developing a communities guide for communities around the WHO ARV guidelines to get communities mobilizing around the guidelines development and to actually make the sort of tall demands in the guidelines to try to make that practical and workable, and to explain to the community why they needed, why they might want viral load on more access to viral load, why it would be important to switch from CD4 cells to monitor their health to using viral load tests, and what it would take to make that actually work in a resource-limited country. One of the ironies about Pim was that he was very caught up in the Maidan Square Revolution and what was happening in Ukraine until it all went bad, and he was actually very down about the fact that there was essentially a civil war going on in Ukraine, and it didn't look easy to resolve. So it's actually very ironic that would take his life. Martine de Schutter worked for AIDS Fund's Building the Gap program, and Building the Gap targets it provides funding and works with organizations that are providing services for men who have sex with men, transgendered women, for people who inject drugs, and for sex workers, communities that that really can't get funding, that really don't. In a country like Kenya, no one is going to spend from the government is going to approve of money for needle exchange. And that was one project. She funded the first needle exchange programs in Kenya. She was also a growing leader. I sat at least a couple activist tables with her, and she was, I think, going to be one of the leaders of the next generation of AIDS advocacy, global international HIV advocacy. So, and she's also sad as well because she left behind a son that she worshipped. With that, I think I'll pass it over to Greg.
Hi, everybody. I'm Craig McClure, and I now direct the HIV program at UNICEF here in New York. Wow. I only met Pim and Martine and Lucy a few times, but I was always so impressed at how passionate and engaged they were as activists and in their work. Glenn I worked with, like you, at WHO. I was in the HIV department at the time. He was in the TB department, and I remember, as you do, how he always seemed to be so busy, and he always seemed to be so feisty, and he really pushed the HIV department to think about TB, and he pushed the TB department to think about HIV. And I think the results of his work sort of speak for themselves now, where HIV-TB is really quite front and center of the response at WHO and in many countries. Joop and Jacqueline. Joop was a mentor, a friend, since 1995, when I first met him in Toronto, where I come from. And at the time, I was working in a community-based treatment information, treatment activist organization. This was, of course, the year before the great breakthroughs with triple drug therapy, and Joop was very involved in those early trials of ART, of PMTCT, as you mentioned, and I never realized back then that PMTCT in pediatrics would be the center of my life now. And we became friends. I was also incredibly struck at how handsome Joop was, and I think I had a crush on him back in the mid-90s. Anyway, a few years later, not too many years later, in 2002, I found myself working in Geneva at WHO for the first time with my husband Ian, who's here, and ended up coordinating what was called the International Treatment Access Coalition, which was the precursor to the 3x5 initiative, which was all about treating 3 million people by 2005 and was hugely ambitious at the time. Joop and someone named Bernard Schfortlander, another hero of mine, were co-leading the International Treatment Access Coalition and asked me to coordinate the activities for them. So we crossed paths again. And then what seemed like so ambitious at the time was achieved. 3 million people were treated, not by 2005, but by 2007. And then Joop became one of the leaders of the universal access treatment movement. And today, 2014, there are 13 million people living with HIV in poor countries who have treatment, which is still only under half the 35 million people in total living with HIV around the world. but is amazing when you think about it. Amazing achievement in such a short time. And just before he died, Theo mentioned that Joop was working on the targeting process for what's going to happen post-2015, and how do we finish the job? How do we finish the job of ending the epidemic as we know it? And setting these targets of 90% of people tested, 90% of people who have HIV know, 90% of people living with HIV know they have HIV, 90% of those people who know they have HIV are on treatment, and 90% of those people on treatment have full viral suppression, are retained in care. And people now are thinking, well, that's just crazy, like we can never achieve that. So Joop, to me, was always like touch point for reminding me that we could have huge ambitions that seemed totally unrealistic, and that we could achieve them. And we did achieve many of them. The other thing about Joop was he wasn't just a clinician and a researcher. He wasn't just about treatment alone. He knew that without social protection, without social change, we couldn't achieve the targets that we set out. And even though there are 13 million people on treatment today around the world, what's become clearer and clearer is there are so many people being left behind. And it's not arbitrary who's being left behind in the global treatment access work. Children are being left behind. Only half as many children as adults have treatment. That's crazy. Gay men and transgendered women in poor countries around the world are being left behind. Sex workers are being left behind. And people who inject drugs are being left behind. All the people that we began that fight for rights and for health and for treatment and all the things that many of us who got involved so long ago in treatment access, treatment activism, so many of those issues we cared about, those people are still being left behind all over the world. The gap is enormous. So when I was thinking about the passing of Joop and other colleagues, but in particular Joop, because we were so close, I had a couple of thoughts. One, well, the first one was that Jacqueline was really the quiet power behind the throne, because Joop had so many things going on. It was so chaotic. So many new NGOs and initiatives and meetings and clinical trials, and it was just all over the map. And Jacqueline, since the time I met Joop in 1995, was always sitting beside him at every meeting with perfect posture. She was a gorgeous woman to her death, taking notes, following up on everything he said and all the ideas he said, and really like keeping him together. And it was just such, I think that Jacqueline really needs to be acknowledged for being this incredibly loyal, quiet, beautiful, dignified person who really made Joop shine behind the scenes. And we were all so happy. They worked together all the years I knew them, but it was only in the last 3 years that they came together as life partners. And all of us kind of had thought for years, surely there's something going on between them. But it was really only in the last few years that they really got together. And it was here in New York at a dinner that the two of them had with Ian and I, where they said to us, you know, we're together now. And we said, about 3 years ago, and we said, finally! So that was the first thought I had, was that, wow, Jacqueline needs to be acknowledged, needs to be recognized for all all that she did. And the second thought I had, which was in relation to how she supported him, was that everything that Yoop did, all the incredible things he did, the incredible mind and drive that he had, the success of all the things he started was so dependent not just on Jacqueline's support, but on this huge movement of people living with HIV, people at risk of HIV, of healthcare providers, of other researchers, of people working in the UN, this huge movement that has been and continues to be the AIDS movement. And I just kind of wanted to finish by saying that as we move into this next era of the response to HIV, where there is, on the one hand, so much hope that we can achieve these ambitious new targets and end the epidemic as we know it once and for all by 2030. That's the goal. That there are such huge gaps that still need to be addressed. And that movement, that kind of all of us, and the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people around the world, that movement to end AIDS, that movement for social change, it's not as strong as it was. And we need to think about, all of us who are still in that movement, what can we do to bring new people into it, to bring young people into it, to keep the momentum going? Because the world is starting to think, oh, AIDS, it's over now. And partly that's we're victims of our own success, that we have achieved so much. But knowing that there's so much more to achieve, knowing that this whole belief in ending AIDS requires so much more effort, I think we need to remember that ending AIDS is not ending the response to AIDS, at least not now and not for the coming decades. So I hope that the deaths of Yoop, Jacqueline, Glenn, Pim, Lucy, and Martine help to galvanize those of us all around the world working in HIV and AIDS, and help us to reach out to young people and get them engaged. Maybe not just about HIV alone. Maybe it's about linking to broader issues. But if we really want to end this epidemic, it's not going to be individuals that do it, however brilliant they are and however hardworking they are, however many cell phones and Blackberries we have. It's going to be from people at the grassroots driving for change. Thank you very much.